First of all, thank you for inviting me, Peter. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm also happy to getting to engage with you guys on what I feel is an important topic in international relations and security studies for the moment. I'm not going to say anything about myself because Peter already introduced. My French is extremely bad, so you have to excuse me on that. And I really hope that we can get a conversation going, even though that my French is so bad. And I hope that you bear with me and speak English to me. I hope we will manage that. I'm going to talk about. Oh, now it's already on. I'm going to talk about decision making in a world of uncertainty. How do we choose what risks and what threats to act upon? And how do we do that? And what are the moral and political implications of that kind of choices? I'm going to talk a little bit about the different techniques that we use, the different technologies that we use in determining what to do in world affairs. So it's the choices, it's risk as a method of making choices, a decision-making tool. That's also why I called it the logic of decision. But what I will claim also is that increasingly uncertainty is the main logic of decision that we have to work with, and we need to understand the difference between risk and uncertainty in order to understand what is actually going on in security affairs today. So that is going to be my main story for these couple of hours. And when we go along, I would really like you to ask questions as we go along, because it's getting a little bit long if I'm going to talk for 2 hours. So hopefully we can get a little bit of discussion going. I'm also going to show you some videos. I'm going to ask some questions that I hope you will get time to work on. But interrupt me if it's too difficult to understand, or if there's something that you need to have me to clarify. I structured it this way, that first of all, I'm going to introduce you to what is risk, a risk analysis, and what is essentially what the concept of risk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what has all this risk to do with security studies and world affairs. Why is it so extremely important, as I see it, to talk about it right now? Then I will go on and talk about uncertainty and risk as different logics of decisions. You probably heard about Ulrich Beck before. Did anyone touch upon the risk society thesis before? Yeah? You heard a little bit about it probably. Last week, okay. So, and then I'm probably going to repeat some stuff, but never mind, I don't think it's going to be the same kind of story anyway. I'm going to talk and I'm going to round up talking a little bit about precaution, and maybe I'm going to also say a few words about resilience as the new kind of techniques or new ways of governing uncertainty, and what is implied with the use of these concepts. Before I start, I would like to say just a few words, because you probably heard a lot about security in international affairs. So why are we then turning to risk? Why is it different? And what we have mostly been talking about, the way we have been talking about it, is that we have been talking about security and national security as something external to the state, something that has to do with our existence and threats to our existence, to our societal safety, our societal security. And risk has mainly been used as a decision-making tools in organizations and in companies. What we used to talk about as normal politics within the affairs of normal organizations that we have inside the state. So there has been some kind of division of labor here. That it has not been so common to talk about risk in international affairs because security was essentially different. We might talk about security in the intelligence world because then we actually have to do with the national interest. We have to defend the national interest, and this is basically what security is about. Risk, on the other hand, has been about opportunities, creating new markets, creating new prosperity, wealth, and so on. So it has a different connotation. It's about progress. It's a different concept. A different concept. The modern concept of risk was established during the 17th century and was mainly related to maritime insurance and piracy. And it came to denote, within the Enlightenment era, what was the possibility of creating progress. It was the possibility of trade, it was the possibility of creating wealth, and actually making a difference. And in this book by Peter Bernstein, he contrasted to the way of our understanding of religion when before modernity, as he writes, that the revolutionary idea that defines the boundary between modern times and the past is the mastery of risk, the notion that the future is more than the whim of gods, and that men and women are not passive before nature. So the idea that you can actually change your destiny. Mary Douglas, who is another key writer on risk, and she's an anthropologist, she has done a lot to contrast the idea of destiny, the religious idea of destiny, that you know your destiny, you cannot do anything about it. You don't have the same kind of ability to create. The human subject is not able to create progress in the same way as we started to believe in the late 17th century and the 18th century. But she's also doing that kind of contrast to show that risk is not a new thing. We just use a different concept. We have actually replaced religion, where there are some kind of modern, some would call a neoliberal idea about how we can change our life, how we should live our life. What is normal? What is outside normality? So this is also part of, before destiny was kind of the normal thing. Now we have a risk or something as put up as a risk that is actually denoting what is normal and what is outside normality. What do we need to do something about is a risk. When we say a risk, when we say something as a risk, that's a nuclear threat to our society, we also ask someone to do something about it. So I don't know, have you talked about securitization? And you have the same kind of idea about security. If you use the word security, it's the same as going out and say that's outside normal politics. We need to do something about it. It's essentially threatening us. The same thing about risk is outside normality. When we say something as a risk, we also say that someone needs to take responsibility and do something about it. And that's also why you have the same kind of idea about normality as you have in security studies and when talking about securitization, that it is outside the normal. You talk about normal unemployment as a level of normality, and unemployment is not a risk in itself when you talk about it that way. But when you talk about unemployment as a great risk to our society, it becomes a risk because then it's outside what we, in our language term, as normal. And usually we use statistics in order to make that kind of difference, to talk about the level of normality. When do we have a rise, of course, a rise in heart diseases? You have some kind of idea that this is the level, this is how it used to be. When it rises to another level, you use that as an argument for saying this is a risk. This is what we need to do something about. In 1921, one of the key writers in risk studies became very famous when he wrote the book called Uncertainty and Profit. And what he did was to put up what became later an extremely popular distinction that he took from Maynard Keynes about uncertainty and risk. And what he actually did was he wanted to categorize the world of risk in different kinds of uncertainty, different kinds of risks. But he said we have risks. Those are that which is predictable, controllable, and therefore possible to calculate. he contrasted that to a different category of life, which is uncertainty, the non-predictable, and that we cannot calculate. He took that from Maynard Keynes, who argued that probability is not the same as certainty. This is just that we have a little bit more knowledge about what is going to happen, and then we can talk about it as a risk. But a risk always contains uncertainty. But the way it has been worked on later on when talking about enterprise risk management in organizations and companies, we still talk about risk and uncertainties, but what is important in risk analysis today is how can we actually move the uncertain about the world into the category of risk. We see that on terrorism. How do we do that? Terrorism is extremely hard to calculate. We do not know when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen and who is going to attack next. Still, the insurance industry is providing insurance on terrorism. And this is a way to think about it is how they actually try to transfer or move what we understood as uncertainty into the category of calculability, the controllability, and predictability. Is simply in order to also, trade those risks on the market. So this is a very popular, the distinction that has been almost iconic in risk studies. It is iconic. And why is it so important to have that kind of distinction? It's because of management. It's because of the idea that we need to make progress, we need to earn money, we need to create wealth. So in order to do that, we need to have an understanding of how is that possible. We need to calculate risk. We need to define and delimit the dangers. Why do we need that, you think? Why do we need to define and delimit the dangers? It is important because otherwise we cannot calculate it. If we do not know where it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, it's impossible to make a calculation of risk. It's impossible to establish the probability or the impact of what is going to happen. So in that selection of risk, we need to define and delimit both the dangers in time and space. So in that way, you can say that risk analysis is also a way of structuring knowledge. We decide on what we know and what we do not know. We might not believe that we know everything. I can give you an example on political risk. It's those risks that companies, organizations run when investing in a foreign market, for example. They need to find out how big is that risk of, for example, investing in Turkey. How can we define that risk? It's extremely difficult, and everyone knows that it's difficult. What are the chances that it's going to be a coup? What is the chances that it's going to be an earthquake? What is the chances there's going to be a flooding? All that kinds of different risks is really hard to tell. But we still try to manage it by structuring our knowledge and put it into some categories. Usually the big companies who are making those kind of risk analysis, they put us on a scale from 1 to 10 saying, you can make that investment in Turkey is probably a 5, but if you want to go into Syria, yeah, it's not so good. We don't want to put it up to a 10 because then it cannot be worth, but we put a 9 on it. And it's not that everyone believes that this is true, but this is a way of structuring the knowledge about what we see. Yes?
Yeah, the companies have a specific way of analyzing political risk, or do they have their own categories of managing this?
Sorry, excuse me, could you?
Yes. No, I will repeat the question, no problem. You're asking whether there are some kind of method involved in doing those risk analysis, but they're very, very different. It also depends on if it's a company and they do it themselves, they will do it depending on what kind of area, of course, they are investing in. But if you look at the big D4S control risk groups and those groups who's actually providing those services to a range of different companies, they have different categories. I should have brought it with me, but they have different categories. But it's everything from expropriation to terrorism to revolt, to all kinds of citizens' unrest, to government overtake, to all kinds of different. But it's those kinds of risks that you can actually delimit within the space of that one nation or that one country. So it's very much, it's country-wise the way they understand it. And then, of course, you can say that, as I explained before, risk identification is also a way to justify contemporary political action, or also not, political in a broad sense, but also to justify organizational action. If you have to defend, what am I going to do? I'm going to invest in Turkey. Did I do my homework well enough? Did I ask the right people about the risk? Okay, I can defend going in there. If something happens, then I have done my work. I have done all the kinds of categorizations, I've done all the calculations, and I can defend, I can justify my actions in doing it. And then, of course, it's a matter of responsibility, because responsibility is the direct consequences of the risks that you choose to mark or that you choose to talk about. I made an interview once when I started doing my PhD. I went to the Copenhagen airport and interviewed one of the security directors, or the security director of Copenhagen airport. And it was in 2003. And I asked him, don't you have an emergency plan on terrorism if there's a terrorist attack against Copenhagen airport? And he said, no, we don't. And I said, that's, you probably not say that today, but it was in 2003. And he said, no, we don't want to put anything in writing. Because if he marked terrorism as a risk to the Copenhagen airport, he was also going to be the one held responsible in the end. So that game about responsibility is also the game about when do you choose to call something a risk or a security risk. That's a game of also a game of responsibility. But what is, and I will get back to that, what is common, why I put this with big letters, is that risk is external to the decision. Risk is something that we look upon outside our windows, and it's something going on outside the organization, outside the nation. It's something that we can determine as external to the company, and that's or external to the organization. And this is, of course, important. Otherwise, you cannot calculate anything. So the idea about that we will see later about co-production, that you are part of producing new kinds of risks, as we of course are, because we're not, we're also part of the world. But that idea is not part of the risk analysis in the original sense. So we are not part of it. It's not our production of risks which is part of a risk analysis. It's something that we look upon and determine as outsiders. And that's also why it tells a lot about the organization, what kind of risk approach they see as important to them. So what has all of this to do with security studies or security politics? As mentioned, and as you can also see in the Aurdau and Münster text that you maybe have read for today, risk is also often understood as different dispositif and a different logic of governance, where security is being about the exceptional. So what is actually in global politics, what is all this about? Why is this important? You can see, you can have some, I think you can probably have more observations on this. But at least you can distill at least two kinds of ways into this debate. One is to looking from risk that more and more threats, you can cyber threats, terrorism, nuclear threats, organized crimes, etc., are handled within the framework of ordinary management. That what we usually thought of as security issues also are dealt with now by local companies, by private actors, networks, NGOs, all kinds of different actors, as something that they need to handle. So this is one way into, and Didier Bigot and Jeff Huysmans, if you're going to read those guys, I don't know, they're talking about this as a management of unease. That more and more issues are the distinction between military and police affairs are not so distinct anymore, that we are increasingly seeing all kinds of different actors as important to national security. Another way to look at it is from the concept of security and say that the concept of security is widening. It has been a debate on widening and deepening of security and the concept of security since the 1980s. And here that security is not only referring to military matters, but also environmental issues, economic issues, immigration, etc., are increasingly talked about as a matter of security, as something that we need to deal with in order to survive. So those two ways into the debate, you can say that this is actually bridging, what is risk and what is actually security, so you don't have the same kind of distinction anymore. In terms of actors and responsibility, you can say that security has become a part of the everyday management of threats by different actors. That security is translated into the daily practices of risk mitigation, into organizations. Civil actors are responsibilized to act in the name of national security. Or you can also say that resilience has become the new mantra that we're putting up, or you can also say precaution, but we're putting up different kinds of concepts in order to actually understand what is going on in the world. What are we talking about here? Just to show you a few examples. This is from an interview with Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And this guy that I interviewed, he was the main responsible under 9/11. So, and then he got this job as security director. That's the very normal way to do it, to get this job as security director at the MTA. MTA is responsible for all train activities in New York City. So it's a quite big thing. What he said to me was, we really want people to stay alert. We make everything part of our security program. The police cannot do it alone. The doors can't do it alone. But together we can do a lot. And we feel that it is because we talk about eyes, that the more eyes there are out there, the more we are looking, 98% of the time, it's probably nothing. But it's a good practice. It keeps everyone's head in the game. It's very American, but it's... But the fact that what they put up and what was later taken up by Department of Homeland Security was this slogan, say, if you see something, say something. So this is not talking alone to companies, but it's also talking to the civil society as such, the individual citizens, that we need to be aware, that we need to internalize security into our everyday practice. So it's not companies only, but it's all kinds of organizations. All citizens need to go there, be suspicious of everything unattended. It's quite scary, right? Hopefully we're not there in Europe yet, but that's why it's such a good example. And here's also another one. It's also, there's 16 million eyes in the city, and we are counting on all of them. If you see something, say something. So that's kind of a company internalizing the entire national political strategy and the way of thinking about national security into their own security politics. An observer from intelligence studies, Sigard, she observed that now we see a quiet intelligence revolution inside American companies. Hotel chains, cruise lines, airlines, theme parks, banks, chemical companies, consumer product manufacturers, etc., have been developing in-house intelligence units. And that's actually quite big. It's not small units. It's big units who's actually also collaborating with intelligence services on how to provide national security. So increasingly we see a responsibilization of civil society and private companies in doing what we before thought of was security politics. And this is where I want to show you a small video. Janet Napolitano, she was secretary of the Department for Homeland Security until 1 or 2 years ago. And this video was set up as a show made by the Department for Homeland Security and shown in all Walmart stores in 2014. So this is just imagine, you know, you're walking around in your neighborhood, in your supermarket, and then you will meet the Minister of Security. and then she will talk to you like this.
Hi, I'm Janet Napolitano, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Homeland Security begins with hometown security. That's why I'm pleased that Walmart is helping to make our communities more safe and secure. If you see something suspicious in the parking lot or in the store, say something immediately. Report suspicious activity to your local police or sheriff. If you need help, ask a Walmart manager for assistance. Thank you for doing your part to help keep our hometowns safe.
So what that could be happening here, you think? Could you imagine the same being happening in France? You know, with the latest attack, and you know, could you imagine that, or do you see the same kind of tendency in France? Are we not here yet? Or are we already here? Are we responsibilizing private citizens, companies in the same way? Yeah? But this was just to show you that, you know, this is not, that the way we think about risk as only an organizational tool has actually also become a way of managing what we before saw as a national security concern. So this is not actually, we're not able to separate. We might still be talking about different practices, different ways of handling security risks, but it is increasingly becoming part of the same political vision that we need to find a path that actually bridges both the original kind of risk analysis of organizations and talking about wealth and creating prosperity and all that, and then having to create a more secure society. But how are these threats different? Because I think that most organizations and most companies would actually consider many of those threats that we before understood as security concerns only. It's actually, you know, very different from a normal risk. And they actually confront the entire idea about calculability and responsibility. That several of those risks that we call terrorism, cyber attacks, organized crime, global climate change, etc., nuclear threats, are seen as catastrophic. It doesn't matter how little the probability is. The impact is going to be huge if it's going to happen. So it's really difficult to say that we're not going to do anything about it because the probability is so low. It might be low, but can we actually afford not doing anything about it? They're not tied to any specific spatial understanding. The nation state, we understand terrorism as a global threat, something that we need to act upon, not as within a certain limited space, but we don't know when it's going to happen, and we don't know where it's going to happen. So there's no temporal sense, and there's no spatiality in the same way as we understood it before. So knowledge about the relationship between means and ends is uncertain. We have very little idea about the consequences of what we do, about how we mitigate, and who are responsible. And why responsibilities get actually, you know, I'm also going to quote that later, but if we don't know, if we cannot term the risk and we cannot know exactly when it's going to happen and where it's going to happen, everyone becomes responsible. But that's also the same as saying that no one is responsible. So it's at the same time as everyone is responsible, no one is basically responsible for anything. So it's also a break with our normal idea about responsibility, accountability of the way we organize our society. And then we can go back to the entire idea about the liberal state and about legal rights and so on and so forth. Because if we do not know what is going to happen, if we act upon the unknown, this is what we term uncertainty, it's not possible to place responsibility anymore. This is another quote from director of Procter & Gamble. And this is just to show that this is not only me who's talking about it in this way. It's actually out there. So it's not only, or now we're also going to talk a little bit about Ulrich Beck, but it's not only him who's like, you know, seeing ghosts all over the world, but you know, everyone is actually talking about. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So VUCA stands for a world that is volatile. It's also uncertain, so we never have full knowledge. It is complex because of the economic independencies, and it is ambiguous. We may not always have all the facts we need to make decisions. So we acknowledge these challenges by saying it's a VUCA, and that we understand that we need to point our enterprise risk effort to try to manage some of the VUCA characteristics. And it has become very popular in corporate circles to talk in that kind of language. In the end, many of the same people are actually also talking about the usual risk language. But this is a part of the vocabulary. It has become a strong part of the vocabulary inside private companies. But that's also when Michael Power in this text say that, you know, risk management is just fake. We cannot count anything anyway. We cannot calculate anything anyway. The only thing we can do is to make sure that we are morally right, that we have acknowledged all the facts that we know, we have made all the norms, we have fulfilled all the norms, we're making the right moral decisions. And that's basically the only thing we can know. And then he's talking about, of course, emergency management as a different kind of tool. But this is basically responding to that kind of uncertainty. If organizations are responding to uncertainties, and if they acknowledge that we cannot control it as an external to ourselves, the world is not only external to ourselves, then we need to have a different approach to risk. And what he's talking about is the implosion of risk analysis. It's compliance. We make a long list of what we did and what we didn't and all that stuff, so it's becoming quite popular. And we have norm systems, we have standardization, et cetera, as a way of making sure that we are acting, that at least we can go back and justify what we did. So that's a different take on the world. That's a way of coping with that kind of uncertainty. Okay, one of the key sociologists that has worked on this is Ulrich Beck, and I think what is important to understand is that he had the mission of trying to be diagnostic about where we're actually going. What kind of society is this? So he wants to tell the story about a huge break in our understanding of risk. And when talking about risk society, he puts risk and society together. Risk is not external to society, it's part of society. But what he's basically talking about is what other people in other parts of the literature is talking about as uncertainty. That we are becoming part of the production of new risk. And that is making our understanding of threats more uncertain. We do not know what is going to happen because we are getting aware of our own co-production of new risks. So this is why he's doing a lot to talk about the state-nature division and how we no longer, why we no longer can see nature as external to society. That nature has become, we are becoming reflective upon our own production of nature. So the society-nature distinction is actually, is not, it's blurring. So what you can say also, it's he will never use the categories of risk and uncertainty in the same way as Frank Knight was doing it, but he will more see it as a kind of historical kind of revolution or transition from our understanding of a neoliberal idea that we can measure everything, that we can actually take it from one category and place it into the other category and say this is totally wrong. This is not about placing categories, because that whole idea is based on the fact that we can look outside the window and then we can talk about what is out there as a risk. But if we are producing the risk ourselves as a society, they're not external to ourselves. And this is why he's talking about reflectivity. As a character, you can see that there's two main arguments in here. Both that there are changing threats, that threats are getting more catastrophic, but also that we have our understanding of ourselves in society has changed. The way in which we approach and recognize the relationship between state and society and nature and ourselves has changed. And that we have our role ourselves in the production of risk. So we are getting confronted with the fact that even though that we thought climate change was something that just happened, we are co-producing, what we are doing, we might not always know how we affect the environment, but we have the understanding and reflection upon how we might affect the environment. Then he has I love this quote, to say that we are living in an age of constructivism. It seems paradoxical because he calls himself a constructivist. So how can you live in an age of constructivism? Actually view it as a world if you are yourself a constructivist. But it's a fact. I think it's a very good quote. And we might want to reflect a bit about post-truth and post-factual society when talking about, are we living in an age of constructivism? If we believe that we ourselves are producing society and nature and everything, we can also basically make everything a part of that construction. Okay, but did you go through risk society last time? Okay. Because then I'm going to just review it just very shortly, to say that this is what I talked about as a normal concept of risk. You can also call it residual risks, that you have risk decisions based on the idea of progress, the possibility of control, and the idea of calculation. The object being, of course, progress, but also wealth. You know who are the defining other, who are your external to you, who you're going to react to as classes, as nations, it's new threats. You know exactly what you're going to talk about. And in the second modernity, that the decision is based on what we do not know, uncertainty about the relationship between past and present and future. What is essential to understand about risk is that risk is a way of making the future present. It's our understanding of the future that make us handle or make us do something. But if we do not know, if we acknowledge that we do not know how the future is going to be, if we cannot forecast anything, how can we then act upon it? So the idea about progress is actually getting a little bit reversed, because we need to acknowledge that kind of undecidability between past and future. And globalization as the redefining the spatial boundaries, the idea about space. I'm not going to repeat all of that, but responsibility is no longer a legal question when the fault cannot be placed. And the object of fear is basically the end of the world. It's the catastrophe. I can give you the slides. I know it's late to say it, but I can give you the slides.
You give all the slides.
Yeah. Let me just see if I forgot anything.
Plus the video.
I think that I'm going to say. I think you have enough then. I'm going to say a little bit about, because I think that what I'm going to say a little bit later about the political solutions that he provides. But I think what is really important to understand is that when he gets a little bit less like what was going on in the past and what is going on today, sometimes he gets a little bit more reflective about, we might not be there yet, or we might not only be there, we might also be a little bit here and there. But he said at some point that what we see today is a power play between fixed actors of the government, the unions, the parties, etc., and the non-territorial element, the capital, the finance, the trade, that we cannot define in any kind of spatiality or any kind of talking about as others. So what we see, and what the literature is increasingly talking about, is that kind of new kind of social actors, new subnational actors, actors that we cannot put, we also call them hybrid actors, actors that, for example, big business, multinational companies, they belong to a state. They are defined within as legally defined as belonging to a state. At the same time, they see themselves as beyond the restriction of the nation state. You can also see other social actors. Maybe you can come up with some examples. Activist movements. You can see it as anonymous, for example. They are American, to some extent American-based, and the critics of the American government. On the other hand, their identity, they are actually defending themselves as a part of a global community. So we are starting to see those kinds of actors that are actually, they're not fixed within the kind of first modernity, the kind of the nation-state order, but they're getting beyond that. They're basically defining a more global kind of order, and having a different understanding of, or not understanding of spatiality. Ulrik Beck was not the only one, has not been the only one who has been coming up with this idea. I don't know if you have read anything about from François Eval. You know him? Great French writer. You should read it. But here he has more the same kind of diagnosis about society. He's talking about precaution. I'm going to talk a little bit about him in a minute, but he's also seeing the kind of more or less the same kind of transition from the first to the second modernity. But also Anthony Giddens are talking about the ambiguity of knowing in today's approaches to risk. Sigmund Baumann is talking about how we live in a vision of the unnamed and unanticipated threat. Frank Fureli, who's talking about the politics of fear, is seeing that we currently see a crisis of causality and a following item of fear. That we need to fear everything because we don't know anything. So that is basically talking to us as in the language of fear. So Ulrik Beck is not the only one who has observed this crisis in the concept of risk and the way we usually manage threat and risks in society. So this is basically, but just to say what I have already been saying, that what Ulrik Beck is saying and what Michael Power is basically also saying is that kind of the neoliberal idea that you can govern through an economic understanding of risk can no longer be the solution. It's actually also acknowledged within their own kind of thinking. It's not only political scientists being critical about whether it's possible or not. It's simply also become a kind of an understanding inside the organizations and inside companies that this is might not be possible anymore. And when Ulrich is saying, but they're trying to feign control over the uncontrollable anyway, they're using risk analysis. And that's also true for many companies. We're still using the kind of same managerial tools. We're still talking about probability and impact for many of the risks that we observe and we choose to handle. And this is and I think Michael Power is the one who has actually been most sophisticated in actually going into the companies and the organizations and looking upon how do we actually feign control. We might agree that it's not possible to control the external environment, that we are a part of it. But how do we defend our decisions then? If we cannot make a risk analysis about what is going to happen in the future, how can we make any kind of decisions? And this is where he comes in and talks about standardization and moral actions and corporate social responsibility and standardizations. You will get to talk yourself in a minute, sorry. I'm sorry. So what is the political solution here in the face of globalization? And Ulrich Beck is basically giving two kinds of solutions. He's saying that we need to understand the global risk society. And one way, how do we govern that? One way is through international collaboration, and I think for those of you who have studied international relations before, you will be able to recognize a little bit of the same kind of idealism, realism debate in here, that there's a bit of idealism, and maybe it's good, but the fact that we can have international collaboration and we can able to come up with regimes that actually controls many of those new catastrophic risks. So we have a common approach. But then he's also talking about sub-political actors, those actors that I just talked about as hybrid actors, as activists, as NGOs, those who cannot be confined within the national borders, the transnational networks. And how can we actually govern those? How can we actually make sure that they're doing this democratically, they're not out of control, and how can we actually ensure kind of a democratic solutions on behalf of those actors? And there is no solution yet, so we don't know. But I would like to show you another video. And when you see it, I would like you to identify arguments similar to the one that we have been just talking about in the risk society, and as a difference between risk as we used to understand it and uncertainty. So, and this is basically it's a small commercial for what is a Danish initiated partnerships called the Green Growth Forum on sustainability.
Each year, the global population increases by about 70 million people. The world is witnessing rapid changes in global consumption and production patterns. We are using up natural resources faster than they can regenerate. The United Nations has concluded that if current consumption and production trends continue, by the 2030s, we'll need the equivalent of 2 planets to support us.
Green growth is the only way to go. It was considered that green and growth were on a collision course. They're not. Green and growth go very well together. In fact, they should go together.
Hey, you know what? Sustainability isn't just a nice to have. It's not a reputation deal. It's really about how I'm going to grow my business into the future.
The economic opportunity in going green is believed to be worth several $1 trillion between now and 2030. In Copenhagen, green solutions are center stage. In a yearly cycle, culminating in an annual summit, the Global Green Growth Forum, 3GF, attracts high-level green growth leaders from governments, business, finance, civil society and international organizations from all regions of the world.
3GF is an important forum. What you have here is for about a day and a half, so it's an incredible power session. You have 300 of the leading, not only thinkers, but also people who can actually put their thinking into action.
We share the common ambition to ensure sustainable, green and inclusive growth and find real and tangible solutions to meet this goal.
The transition to a green economy is a global effort. 3GF is led by the governments of China, Denmark, Ethiopia, Kenya, Korea, Mexico and Qatar, who invite other leaders for common action.
Governments, investors, companies, civil society and researchers cannot do the job by themselves. We need to collaborate to succeed.
Partnerships between public and private actors and different sectors are key to generate green growth. Throughout the year, 3GF is a platform for developing, testing and bringing to scale collaborative partnerships for green growth, across borders, across sectors, across mindsets. 3GF is already resulting in concrete solutions. One of these is on food waste.
We're wasting almost $700 billion a year on food that should stay in the food system.
At 3GF, private companies and international organizations have agreed to develop a protocol to enable the measuring of food waste and loss.
That's an example of a public-private partnership that actually is going to change the way that food waste and loss is treated, and it will be reduced as a result.
Another example of a 3GF partnership is on water. Up to 40% of all water in cities in developing countries is lost, mainly due to leakages. The 3GF partnership enables new financing models which focus on reducing water leakages to ensure sustainable water management. The success of a partnership depends on whether it can push green technologies, practices, policies, finance or business models to become adopted on a large scale and to become part of society.
Let us use forums like this to accelerate away from an unsustainable past to a future that respects people and planet. We have an historic opportunity to leave a legacy that will reverberate through generations to come.
Okay. Can you just sit next to, just talk to the one next to yourself?
The question, what is risk and what is uncertainty?
Identify arguments similar to the ones that we have just talked about risk and uncertainty. Yes? Yes? Yeah, that's true. Yes, that's right. Good. Yes.
In our group, we actually thought that most of the video actually relates to the slide which is up right now instead of risk and uncertainty, because actually most of the video was dealing with problems that are not potentially happening in the future, but they're actually happening right now. So what they were saying is there's a shortage of food in some parts of the world and there's food waste in other parts of the world, so we need to bring those two together to solve the problem which is actually here at the moment. So most of that video, even though it's a call to action, is a call to action based on problems at the present state of the world. Even though obviously the beginning of the video sounded quite different because it was projecting into the future. I think that was actually not the main point of the video.
Yes?
One of the things that struck us too was that even though there is this reflexive element about the production of risk, for instance, they keep talking about consumption and production habits, they makes it like the solutions that they present is sort of based on the framework of the first modernity, so very rational, very calculated. They quote statistics and like computations to sort of get the planet back on track with the progress line from which we deviated at some point.
So still the belief in the control, yeah. You said before that it mainly related to that slide. How is it relating to that slide?
Because our other videos focusing on solutions, and that one solution they put forward is that conference, everyone, and it's really working together to deal with problems on the global scale.
So solutions, global. Yes?
And then we also discussed in terms of solutions, they had a framework that relate to the first modernity and actors of nation states and not necessarily transnational networks. So they're focusing more on actors like states or organizations and not nebulous cyber networks that could mobilize people's actions.
Yes, you can read it that way as a kind of a very traditional kind of understanding of how networks are actually working. Can you read it in other ways? Did anyone talk about that? They also point to public-private partnerships all the time. So they also, they have that kind of idea about networks, new kinds of actors being important. We have to stand together and blah, blah, all that stuff. So it's in that sense, but I think you're right when it comes down to what is actually going to solve the problem in the end. The state system needs to have some kind of control over that kind of, it is also a partnership initiated by governments. So that might be why they put it in those terms. But they're starting to point to the role of different social actors. Others? No? What about neoliberalism? Did you see anything of that? The kind of economic, you said before that the point to this catastrophic kind of understanding of risks. The two globes, so if we don't do anything, we're going to go, we're not going to survive.
Yes? Well, they do mention as a way to incentivize people who might not have been convinced by the end of the world argument that there's a huge economic profit
exactly.
that can be made out of this green transition.
Yes. So it's kind of in the logic of what Ulrich Beck is saying, this is not really working because we're going to, in the end, we're going to say this is not, we can decouple that of, we don't have to go down the drain in economic terms. We can have wealth and sustainability at the same time. We do not have to choose between those. Where he would say, that's just feigning control over the uncontrollable. That's not possible. So that kind of paradox that he's pointing to is basically, being talked up as a kind of an opportunity making instead. So that's also why this is not to say that this is just Beck. It is exactly what you're saying. It's a little bit confusing because they're basically pointing to normal risk understandings that we can control the future. On the other hand, it's also extremely difficult to control it, and we need to do all we can in order to find out, in order to make sure that we're going to survive anyway, even though it's not controllable. So that kind of, those paradoxes is basically a main part of the story. Okay, thank you. You're going to have to discuss a little bit more in just a second. Peter told me to prepare for 1 hour, so I'm going to try to engage you again. So I hope it's okay. Just a few words about what are the political solutions here. how do we see political solutions on this? Of course, we saw just one way of trying, and maybe not a clear one, but trying to point to some of the different solutions that Beck is pointing to. Another way have been to talk about the precautionary principle. You probably heard about that. And I think your president is currently talking about, what is this called, a pact on sustainability or environment, a pact on the environment, where precaution is a part of the pact of how to get about this. But it became established as an approach to risk mitigation, as it says in the Brundtland report from '92, and it was again taken up in the later revisions and with the Sustainable Development Goals last year. It was repeated that precaution is where there is a threat of serious and irreversible damage, a lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing such measures. So it's now I got to write it a little bit clumsy, but it's basically to say that if we do not have full certainty about what is going to happen in the future, we're going to act anyway. But the idea has basically, and there has been a lot of writing about whether the precautionary principle is actually been useful and how it has been engaged with in political negotiations, especially the WTO, where the Europeans had said, we are against the use of GMOs, and because out of a precautionary principles, because we do not know what the effect is going to be. This is one of the risks that there's so much uncertainty that we do not know how to handle it. On the other part of the ocean in the US, they said there's plenty of scientific certainty about this. So that's why we need to have trade on this. And those have been going on for a long time, those kinds of negotiations. But precaution has basically, in those terms, been used as a way of denoting the fact that you need to handle, you need to act as a kind of a strategy, even though that you do not have enough knowledge. And this is a quote from François Eval, whom I talked about just a few minutes ago. And he's basically talking about what is happening to science, what is happening to our knowledge, understanding of knowledge, if we just accept that we are living in a world of uncertainty. Then he's writing why the language of risk against the background of her scientific expertise used to be sufficient to describe all types of uncertainties. The new paradigm, precaution, sees uncertainties in the light of an even newer science, science that is consulted for less than the knowledge it offers, than the doubt it insinuates. And what does he exactly mean by that? He's basically arguing that if we cannot, it's basically saying we are now in a world of precaution where we think in terms of uncertainty, then we act in terms of uncertainty. But then we cannot accept any kind of scientific knowledge anymore. And what is then happening to responsibility, etc., etc. But what he's then saying, this is not doing away with science. We just have a different role. And the role is that we need to show doubt. We need to be critical. We need to show exactly what is that things might not be going as we thought it would in the beginning. So it's a different role of science. It's not doing away with science, but it's giving science a new life. Is that not scary? You think, as now you're taking a degree here at the university, what is then going to happen? How can our role just to create doubt and not certainty anymore? And what kind of society is it that we are creating in doing that? You're being depressed now? Or?
No, yeah, I'm depressed. It's kind of like an it's the realization of Cartesianism, right? You have the doubt, which is the foundation for science. But what I want to ask you is, do you think there's a relationship between this kind of doubt And the doubt we ask to have of human beings that you talked about earlier on,
Yeah.
if you see something, say something. Suspicion
Yeah.
of other people, that's the foundation
Yeah.
for security, and here doubt is the foundation for
I
science.
think that's. I think that François Val is actually getting to that question when he says that what we're doing is that we leave it up to moral ethics and morality of the public to decide what is right and wrong, to the masses basically. To say that in that sense, if you see something, say something, and it's basically up to society as such. You do not have any authority, you do not have any hierarchy in the same way as you had before, but it's basically up to the public and the public ethics to decide what is right and wrong. So it's a different kind of ethics involved in it. But you are the ethics experts here. So, yeah. It's actually here. The consequences for responsibility is that because of this decline of innocence, that we are all becoming responsible. And we are all not responsible for anything. So that is basically, how can we then act and how can we then take decisions in that kind of a world? So it's basically what is right and what is wrong is that moral obligations become swallowed up in a public ethics.
It could be regarded as good news. Last week I was trying to tell you, you remember, that the threats were all around us and maybe the person sitting next to you was a terrorist. Remember? That there was sort of a constant presence of threat. Mm-hmm. And that means that we have to decide how to organize society and live together in such a way that we can live with the threats being present. Isn't that the birth of a new sort of self-governance, a new...
You can, if you're very optimistic, you can say if you're able to teach and able to enlighten people on how to act morally and how to behave correctly, and that is, I think that is somehow what they're trying to do in many private companies, and especially in private communities, amongst private companies, is to put up norm systems, voluntarily norm systems, that we need to agree on how we do this. We need to agree on this and that. But that also demands a whole lot of people on that in terms of behavior. So we do not have any kind of reference point outside to point to.
So I think it's privatization of ethics.
Yeah, it becomes a little bit like that, right? Yeah. Of course, you can say that you can engage society and you can engage the public. You can enlighten people on what is going on and all the critical issues that need to be dealt with. Be reflective about your own production of risks when you look at the one sitting next to you. But it demands a lot for the single individual to be reflexive about giving up the kind of governance that actually lies in the entire idea about science. So I'm the old guy. I'm the old guy now, basically defending it, the old system. Just before we have before I put you into the discussion again, as the last thing, I would just say a few words about. I'll just change the order a little bit. What are the new management tools here? How can we? How is that engaged within both the private sector and the public sector? What kind of decision-making logic are we actually talking? How is that translated into actual action? And I think there are actually at least 4 ways of talking about this: scenario analysis, how to think new futures. We do not know. We do not attempt to predict anything, but we actually, out of our own mental construct, our imagination, are trying to tell what is the future going to be. There's a small risk, maybe it's not so small, that we're going to make our imaginations real. And that might be a huge risk involved in that. The use of big data. This is not the idea that you can actually causally determine the means and ends between. You cannot control anything in terms of means and ends because you do not have a motive necessarily when doing big data, at least in security terms. But you might, or you will try to find the abnormal patterns, to predict the unpredictable, to try to cover as much data as you can in order to show that there's something abnormal here that we need to find out what is going to. So it's paradoxical in the sense that you want to predict something which you actually believe is non-predictable. But you do it anyway because you're starting to believe that it's possible to find the deviations, the out of the normal, that I also talked about as a risk before. So the risk is still out of the ordinary. It's just a different way of organizing, of finding that out of the ordinary, of finding that kind of risk. Then you have, as Michael Power is talking about, you have emergency management. It's basically also what some people are referring to as resilience a lot. The fact that you can manage risks by being able to bounce back very quickly. You know that something is going to happen. You are in the Chandler text, you can see that the fact that the failure is unavoidable. But at a micro level, you believe in the possibility of managing that failure through, and one of the key tools is emergency management and continuity planning. And then I think one last management tools, as we talked about, is compliance and norm systems. That you have the ISO standards. I don't know if you heard about that before. You have some kind of it's a standard. You have one on risk that all companies have to live up to certain risk norms. So they can. It's basically a compliance system that they can sit and check whether they did this and this, and whether they have an organization that is holistic about risk, and whether they, all kinds of different stuff. The corporate social responsibility, that it's a responsible company, that it's sustainable, etc. So that also is a way of managing new risks, because it makes you able to justify your own actions, and that's basically, as Michael Power is arguing, the only thing you can do in a world of uncertainty. So I would say that those four is at least, maybe you can come up with a fifth, but that at least is the kind of a new responses to that kind of uncertainty. Those are not like, I don't think Ulrich Beck would say that those are, fitting into that kind of schisma that he's putting up. But that is, in the real world, some of the answers that has been given to that kind of understanding of uncertainty. And then I would very much like to hear, your thoughts on this. And I was, it's a little bit difficult to sit here at home and you don't know your students you're standing before, and how are you going, what do you know before, and how are you going to respond to this. But at least I think we should try to talk a little bit about examples in world politics where you see these risk practices applied. Do you see that kind of understanding of knowledge anywhere? And what is that doing to the idea of the state as the main security provider?
Right, so same exercise, 10 minutes?
Same exercise, 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more. It's a little bit more difficult, I think. Or maybe not, I don't know.
Find your partner in common and try to make a small list, maybe 2 or 3, 4.
Just examples, empirical examples, if you can come up with some, something that it might not have to be clear-cut. Probably isn't. Did you think about any examples? Oh, of course you thought about it. But what did you talk about? Are there any good examples out there? You don't have to make the entire analysis. It's okay just to say something. Yes? Yeah, you.
So the both of us were thinking about the safety check on Facebook, when you just give personal information about you on Facebook, about the place where you are, and about your physical integrity too, in a context where you know nothing about the events that are happening around you, and you just want to tell the person you like or you love that you're alive and that everything is okay. And in such a situation, the state is no longer a security provider, because you give all the information to private companies who's supposed to share the information about you and using your personal data about this.
Yeah. So Facebook is a good example of one of those multinational companies that is really hard to control within the jurisdiction of the nation state, and which actually has a appeal to a much higher, a different kind of consciousness outside the legal system, the normal legal system. Yeah, it's a good example. There was another one down here.
In our group, we mostly talk about the scenario analysis and data. One obvious example of the scenario analysis would be all the climate models, which predict based on what we have now and what we would have in 100 years.
Yeah.
And then for big data, well, obviously there's loads of surveillance, loads of intelligence with, for example, phone calls, emails, messages are analyzed. And then in our group we were just raising the question, what do you mean by this distinction between normal and abnormal? In what sense? Is that, for example, that a certain combination of keywords can be abnormal in the sense that someone who says bomb and Petersen station will be picked out?
It's the fact that you will, I'm not a technical specialist on this, but the fact that you will have a big data set. And instead of just, normally when you have a suspicion, you will have some kind of motive that you will actually go to investigate. But here's basically by running a big data set, you can see what is popping up as a normal kind of sequence. That normally you will have a no, it's a bad example. A guy from Turkey traveling to Turkey and buying Turkish food in the store next around the corner. But if you have suddenly one of those white Danes with red hair and who has been in a neo-Nazist kind of community, and suddenly he travels to Turkey, it will be an abnormal in that kind of data set. It will probably appear as an abnormal behavior, even though that you might not be suspicious of him in the beginning. It creates a suspicion that you have this entire data set. So the fact that you can run different kinds of, you run the data, the fact that it's big is actually to show an abnormal activity. And the abnormal is not, in risk analysis, you talk about the abnormal and the normal as the acceptability. What can you accept as society? And when do we talk about a risk as something that we need to do something about? Here's actually the data that speaks for you and decides what is abnormal and what is normal, just as a little bit as statistics was doing before.
In that case, I still want to add maybe that in big data, very often keywords are important. I think this fact is, in that sense, very important that keywords always also include a judgment on a human basis. So if you would just tell an AI fit out the abnormal, that would be ethically very nice for you, because you are not doing a judgment. But putting in judgments before, I think is a different thing.
So in the algorithms, there's a lot of politics, basically, right? Or in the what you say in the choice of the concepts that you look for, there's also politics in that. There's also a suspiciousness in that. Is that what you mean?
Well, what I'm talking about actually goes in various directions. But for example, big data could be the chance of removing human prejudice against individuals, which could be helpful. For example, if you have a human controlling people at the airport, he would probably pick out on those people who have darker skin or have beards or look more like the image of a terrorist which he has in his mind, but an AI might not have the same stereotype of a terrorist.
But I think the point is, sorry, no.
Sorry, I would highly disagree with that actually, because there's a big debate about who codes and how you code AI specifically and what you define as a threat. And it's people who put in those codes, and of course you can try to be as impartial as you can, but ultimately it does turn out, because you end up relying on patterns that you think, oh, a Turkish person going to Turkey might seem normal, but then you code that into a system, or you code facial patterns or so when you're going through the airport security and you get a picture taken for visa or whatever, all of those things, they're coded, and then within that code there could be bias, and there's strong bias against, for instance, African Americans, especially with facial recognition technology. So all of these things are actually, I think, more biased, at least right now, and I don't know if it's possible to.
Yes?
To put it in, to sort of summarize, to put it in one simple way, big data is useless unless you have a query, right? You have to ask the question. That's a bit what Professor Petersen is saying, that you have to ask the question, and in asking the question, you're politicizing already. There's no, it's a bit what you're saying as well, that it's a bit, there's no objective question. There's always a catch, there's always an orientation or a prejudice or assumption.
I don't think that has to be true.
No?
No. So one example which came up immediately in my mind when you were talking about abnormal actually relates to my bank transfers, when one of them was completely blocked because the AI of my bank system identified my unusual transaction as fraud, even though I was doing it. So I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is something which would be possible on a purely statistical basis, and you would have to put in nothing else but the data that I put in there without any criteria, and say, well, collect data over a certain period of time, and then if there's after that transactions which are completely different and outside of certain margins, then don't allow those. And you could start and do a similar thing, obviously, they would be more complicated, but you could do similar things if you have sufficient data.
So the query generated by statistical robot would be unprejudiced, but then it'd be only meaningful if it was radically random, completely, absolutely random identification of an anomaly in the database. And that's the definition of a meaningless question and a meaningless result as well. So even though what happened to you in your bank system, it was already predisposed by the way the AI of the query was set up by your bank or whoever, I think. Anyway, we disagree.
No, yeah. I think that another part of that debate is a huge debate, is about the motive. What is happening to the fact that normal police investigation, at least before, had a motive. You needed to have some kind of suspiciousness in order to investigate something. But now suddenly it becomes innocent, because the data is, like you're saying, speaking for itself. So you don't, as I talked about normal risk analysis, you will have some kind of responsibility of defining that motive, whether that's true or not, or whether you have actually done your investigation well enough. And suddenly it becomes out of your own control. So this is just to say that it's not to judge whether that's right or wrong, but it's just to say it's a different political move to say that we don't need to have any kind of idea about who is doing what and why. We don't need the why anymore.
And that's the shift we have in legal justification.
Yes, exactly.
We no longer need suspicion.
Yeah. And of course you need to make up the story afterwards, probably. Okay, that was a good example, I think, of risk and uncertainty kind of decision making. Other examples? Yeah. Another example, you are welcome to come with another example. We have time for it, yes.
Other examples, for example, for the standards, is that if a car company builds their car according to the standards, safety standards, then they could of course say, well, if then happens anything to the car owner during an accident, we are not responsible because we didn't make up those regulations. So that is something which obviously guarantees a certain amount of safety, but also takes away the responsibility from the manufacturers.
Yes. Nice. Others like to contribute? It's okay. It has been a long 2 hours. Okay, let's round off then. Any kinds of, for the Q&A, any questions, anything you would like to raise or ask me? Yes?
I had a question about the first video that you showed with the former or present
Secretary.
Yeah, with the Secretary of Homeland Defense. What year was that in? That they
2014.
2014. And it was only in Walmart?
It's only in Walmart stores. I actually made an interview with the Walmart director and asked him, you know, why on earth would you do that? But it seems like irrational from a kind of risk perspective, because, you know, it just reminds people how you know, it's like the politics of fear, you know, what can actually happen when I go out in the parking lot. So from a kind of security perspective, economic perspective of the company, it's not really rational to put out the Secretary General of Department for Homeland Security. But he responded that he did agree to do that out of corporate patriotism. So to put it up then he said, okay, I agreed to do that for 3 weeks during the holiday season, and that was it. So it was kind of what he called corporate patriotism. In all of the Walmart? All Walmart stores.
Because Walmart tends to be present only in certain neighborhoods in the U.S. Because it's very rare that you would find a Walmart in a very rich, upscale New York neighborhood. So it's interesting that it's only that certain population that got exposed.
I haven't, you know, they might have asked other department stores whether they wanted to do the same, but I don't know. but at least they did it. But Walmart has a huge security department. It's like 100, it's 200 and something working only in the headquarters on security. There's also a Walmart watch of citizens groups going against the security department of Walmart because they're so big. It's headed by a former FBI agent who was the one who actually, you know, exposed one of the big spies, Hansen.
Walmart's like a small nation state.
So it's small. It is like a small nation state. They also have their own guards, and it's almost like their own police department. So, and they do investigations, and there was in the Walmart. Yeah, you can go and look at the internet. It's actually a lot of fun. No, it's also a little bit scary, but it's, you know, what is actually can happen within a private company in terms of security. Yes. Other questions? Yes.
Like, it's more a remark than maybe a very specific question, and it concerns actually both lectures that we've had so far, which is that so far we haven't really been talking about the distinction between perceived risk and objective risk as such. So my question, I guess, would be, to what extent within the research of risk politics of risk, can we understand how, for example, objective facts or more emotional motives govern politics, for example?
There's a huge literature on perceptions and psychology of risks, but I think that this is actually, I think indirectly this is about the objective versus the subjective understanding. You can say that in the fact that before in the kind of traditional risk tradition, risk was an object, something that you can turn to and calculate, something which was up there. But still, even though you could do that, you still had to decide what is acceptable for us as an organization, or for me as for us as a society. So the discussion has always been, what should we choose to do? What should we choose to focus on? There's a lot. There's GMOs. There's pandemics. There's nuclear risk. There's a lot of risks that we can choose to focus on. So how do we actually choose that? So even though I might not agree that there are something called objective risks, but if there are, we still need to have to choose upon which of them we need to act upon. And that is the entire literature, is how to decide and make decisions on risks. And then, of course, it becomes the politics of doing that, and the politics of blaming and blaming others for not being responsible and all that. So there's a politics part of it, in that kind of the choices of how to do it, and the calculability and the non-calculability. Is that? So I think it is implicit in the entire literature, but I think most of authors, also the traditional ones, who believes in the fact that there are some risks that is coming to us, are actually saying that, but what is important is how society decides on doing it and what we are going to do about it. How we rank it, how we prioritize.
Isn't society biased by the way that those risks are presented? I don't know, for instance, terrorism represents an infinitesimal fraction of deaths in modern societies, and yet it completely occupies the media space and media time. Every time there's an attack somewhere in the world, the terrorist risk is discussed a lot, obviously, and yet the reality for anyone to die in a terrorist attack is very low. But it has a lot of political power, so in the end, it ends up as a major risk of modern days, but realistically it's not. So.
Yes.
So I would argue the political vision of risk is way more important than what societies in the end chooses.
But what I mean by society chooses, that choice of normality, that choice of acceptability is also part of the context, of course. So it's not standing outside any kind of political context. And I think Mary Douglas is probably the one who has been writing mostly about, how different cultures are having different risk profiles. So you prioritize your risk either in a hierarchical organizations. It might be the president who actually defines what is going to be the risk, and this is what for society just to accept. In an egalitarian society, or in a market-based society, it might be the fact that we all need to run a risk, and it needs to be survival of the fittest. And there might be different kind of cultures that defines how we're going to react to risk. But that was a little bit too much to get into today. But that is very exciting. That's very interesting. Then I would just say thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you.